When Sydney Loofe failed to show up for her shift at Menards, a home improvement store in Lincoln, Nebraska in 2017, her loved ones knew something was wrong. Sydney never skipped work without calling first. Her mother tried calling and texting Sydney but received no response. Following interviews with Sydney's friends and a search of her phone records, investigators narrowed their search to 2 suspects. Something horrific happened that night Sydney disappeared. What happened to Sydney illustrates what can happen when swiping right turns out wrong. George and Susie Loofe welcomed a little girl named Sydney on August 8, 1993. Sydney's entire family worked in the education field. Her siblings were educators, and her mother, Susie, worked as a resource teacher for the district. During Sydney's time at Nebraska Oakdale High School, her father, George Loofe, was the principal. The week before Sydney's disappearance, she visited her hometown of Nebraska. She attended a craft fair and visited her family during her visit. Several days later, Susie and George helped Sydney clean her apartment and buy groceries. Sydney suffered from a number of ailments, including scoliosis, which prevented her from participating in sports. She was also affected by anxiety and depression. While Susie Loofe was in town, she took Sydney to her doctor for a checkup. There, Sydney discussed several medications she could take to deal with her mental illness with the doctor. The next time Susie heard from her daughter, she saw on Snapchat that Sydney had a date that evening. In the photo, Susie noted that her daughter looked beautiful and happy. Susie contacted Sydney in the morning to find out how her night had turned out. She never returned her mother's call or text. Susie Loofe became concerned when she discovered Sydney hadn't arrived at work on November 16, 2017. Because Susie knew Sydney would inform someone if she had to miss work, she contacted the Lincoln Police Department to request a welfare check on her. Nothing in the house seemed to indicate foul play. However, one thing did stand out. Sydney's mother was upset when she noticed that her daughter's beloved cat hadn't been fed and was out of water. There was no doubt in Susie Loofe's mind that Sydney would never have allowed that to happen unless she had no other choice. A press conference was held to announce Sydney's disappearance, and George Loofe begged for her safe return. He asked anyone with any information to come forward and assist the authorities. To encourage people to post tips and write kind words about the missing girl, Sydney's family created a Facebook page, Finding Sydney Loofe. Volunteers and donations were plentiful during the search for Sydney. Despite the endless number of people who wanted to help find Sydney, no one could locate her. A truck company owner gave his employees flyers to distribute on their routes, and people donated billboards and flyers. Brooklyn McChrystal, Sydney's best friend, was one of the few people she confided in about her dating life. On November 14th, Sydney told Brooklyn she was hanging out with Aubry, whom she met on Tinder. Aubry was Sydney's dream girl, and she was very excited about their second date, scheduled for the following evening. After her best friend was reported missing, Brooklyn turned to Tinder to find Aubry. After creating a fake profile, Brooklyn swiped left on one account after another until she found Aubry. Eventually, Aubry's profile came up, and Brooklyn swiped right. She had made a match. Aubry replied to Brooklyn's message, and as the two began messaging each other, she gave Brooklyn her phone number shortly after they started talking. As soon as Brooklyn received Aubry's phone number, she gave it to police. Investigators tracked Sydney's cell phone to a residence in Wilbur, Nebraska, rented by Bailey Boswell and Aubry Trail. When investigators arrived at Bailey and Aubry's house, no one answered. Police entered the home using the landlord's key but found nothing suspicious. Only one thing caught the officers' attention: the overwhelming smell of bleach. The next day, investigators obtained a search warrant for Bailey and Aubry's house, but the place looked exactly the same as the day before. Law enforcement found nothing of value. Investigators reported that 23-year-old Bailey Boswell and 51-year-old Aubry Trail were being investigated as suspects in Sydney's disappearance. After the announcement that they were suspects, Bailey and Aubry posted a video on the Facebook group created by Sydney's loved ones. Bailey said in the video that she spent time with Sydney on November 14th and 15th. She also admitted using the alias Audrey when chatting with girls on Tinder. After the date with Sydney on November 15th, Bailey left Sydney at a friend's house. According to Bailey, Sydney and Bailey planned to go to the casino together that weekend. She was worried about Sydney too, she said on the video. A sloppy older man, Aubry Trail, sat beside Bailey throughout the video until the end, when he expressed sympathy for Sydney's family and hoped she would return soon. On November 30th, Bailey and Aubry were arrested in Branson, Missouri on charges unrelated to Sydney's disappearance. Allegedly, the couple planned to flee to Mexico. Aubry had a lengthy criminal record before he was arrested in Branson. In 1999, he was charged with theft in the third degree in Iowa. He was incarcerated for 4 years in 2010 after writing a fraudulent check. Sydney's disappearance had prompted endless searches. The police released a description of Sydney early on in the investigation. She was described as blonde, blue-eyed, and tattooed. Her forearm was adorned with a yin-yang symbol and the word believe. Sydney Loofe organized a fundraising campaign to aid in the search for Sydney. 5 days after the campaign began, it raised $3,000 of its $30,000 goal, with any remaining funds being donated to a missing persons organization. After several weeks of searching, investigators found Sydney's remains in 13 garbage bags in Clay County, 1 hour from where her phone pinged. The bags were thrown in ditches by the wayside. Investigators found several adult toys and clothing items discarded with Sydney's remains. Sydney's funeral took place on December 11, 2017. According to her obituary, she was baptized in 1993 at Grace Lutheran Church in Nebraska, where her memorial service was held. Friends and family gathered at Sydney's home for a candlelight vigil after her remains were identified. The event was held at the Sunken Gardens in Lincoln, where Sydney used to live. In connection with Sydney's death, Bailey Boswell and Aubry Trail were charged with murder. They were also charged with improper disposal of human remains and conspiracy to murder. Bailey pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges, while Aubry pleaded not guilty to 2 charges. Because their defense lawyers said Wilbur would not provide a fair trial, Aubry and Bailey's separate trials were held in another county. Aubry Trail provided authorities with several confessions regarding the night Sydney died. During his first confession, Aubry confessed that he was solely responsible. Later, he changed his mind and said the death occurred after Sydney returned for the 3rd date with Bailey on November 16th. Sydney's family and friends were hurt by his final confession. He claimed Sydney had slept with Aubry and Bailey and died during a rough sexual encounter. When Bailey and Audrey's trials were held, the prosecution informed the jury that they planned to prove that Bailey and Audrey used Tinder to lure Sydney back to their shared home. As soon as Sydney came back from her first date, she would have been eager to see her dream girl again and would have willingly traveled to Wilbur to see her the next day. Sydney is unlikely to have known that Aubry would be present at that time, according to the prosecution's case against him. As soon as Sydney entered the house, Aubry is believed to have attacked her immediately. Approximately 20 minutes later, Sydney died, and the 2 defendants buried her lifeless body in Clay County the next day. The prosecutors showed the jury footage of Bailey and Aubry buying the tools they would have used to dismember Sydney hours before her death. 3 women testified how in July 2019, during a conversation with Aubry, he told them he wanted to kill a woman and film the process. Their landlord testified at the trial that their apartment reeked of bleach after Sydney disappeared. During the trial, defense attorneys emphasized Aubry's traumatic childhood. Because of his impoverished childhood, he suffered abuse that shaped him into the man he is today. In a brazen act, Aubry attempted suicide during the trial. Before cutting his throat, Aubry yelled, "Bailey is innocent. Curse you." He then slit Bailey's throat. Nevertheless, he was saved but absent from court for a few weeks. After returning to the courtroom, Aubry promised to remain a good boy throughout the trial. The judge forced Aubry to wear handcuffs and shackles for his and everyone else's safety. During Bailey's trial, her lawyer claimed she suffered abuse from Aubry. At the time Bailey met Aubry, she had just broken up with the father of her child and was struggling financially. The prosecutors defiantly denied Bailey's victimhood claim. The prosecution at Bailey's trial testified that Bailey lured Sydney to her death. Several pieces of evidence showed that Bailey seduced her on Tinder. While Bailey gave Sydney a false sense of security, she and Aubry had nefarious plans for the younger woman all along. In court, a woman testified against Bailey. She had previously discussed dismemberment and murder with her. Bailey's defense attorneys also claimed she had a troubled childhood, which made her vulnerable to Aubry's manipulation. According to Bailey's attorneys, Aubry was a deceitful person who tricked Bailey. Neither Bailey nor Aubry's attorneys wanted their client to receive the death penalty and were doing everything they could to avoid it. After only a few hours of deliberation, Aubry was found not guilty of first-degree murder in 2021. During Aubry's sentencing trial, a 3-judge panel sentenced him to death. Bailey was convicted of murder as well and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In an unrelated hearing, Bailey and Aubry were found guilty of defrauding coin dealers of millions of dollars. Bailey Boswell is currently incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women. Aubry is on death row at Tukmak State Correction Institute. There are over 30,000 followers on the Celebrating Sydney Loofe Facebook page, which was originally the Finding Sydney Loofe page. The Set Me Free Project, an anti-trafficking organization, donated a scholarship in Sydney's honor to a student pursuing a criminal justice, social work, or online safety career. Online dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, and OkCupid have become insanely popular in recent years. Many people have met their spouses through these apps, or formed lifelong friendships. However, some malicious people are always looking for vulnerable people. Even though these people troll dating apps looking for their ideal victim, there are ways to stay safe and aware when using them. Online dating can be very safe if you follow a few simple rules. Tell a trusted friend or family member when you're heading out from making plans with someone on a dating app. It is always smart to meet in public, such as a restaurant, coffee shop, or the mall. Additionally, Tinder recommends staying in public for the duration of your date. The app does not advise users to return to someone's apartment or home after meeting them. The most important thing is to trust your gut instincts. Don't hesitate to leave or contact someone if something feels off. Stay safe and vigilant when swiping. What do you think about the tragic murder of Sydney Loofe? Was Bailey Boswell also a victim of Aubry trails? Or was she, like Aubry, a cold-hearted murderer? What case would you like to see covered next? And don't forget to hit the bell icon and subscribe.